Welcome to In the Know, the program that explores hot topics and local important issues so that you'll be in the know. I'm your host, Mike Kasperzak, and I'm joined today by Audrey Seymour Ramberg, the Assistant City Manager from the City of Mountain View, and by Nancy Bremeau, a Los Altos resident and kind of a local activist, right, Nancy?
That's correct.
All right. Well, we're going to be talking today about what academics would call public engagement. But the rest of us would probably think more along the lines of how we, the people, engage with and communicate with our government. So, Audrey, why don't we start with you? And I know that public officials, city staff, do a lot of work around public engagement, but maybe you could describe what public engagement is and sort of how it involves city politics.
Great. I think local government is really special in the way that it can be directly connected with the people who live in a community, much more so than higher levels of government, state and federal government. And the way that I look at the role of city government is to be, in many ways, a convener, to try to seek out and hear the voices of the community. And I think it's important to say voices because there's not really one monolithic voice of what the community's values and needs are. Often that's the case. And to be that convener, to try to hear those voices, try to develop consensus if that's possible, and compromise when there isn't consensus, and then to use the power that government has through our legislative authority and taxation to be the instrument to make that community will a reality, whether it's through creating programs or enacting new policies. And so it's really critical in either of those instances to have public engagement that both provides information and seeks input and does that in a way that's effective. And often, I think, in our area in particular, as we have city council meetings that go past 1 a.m., the issues are really complicated. I have a friend from Boston who calls them the wicked problems. They don't have one easy solution. And so the engagement and hearing those voices is really quite critical. And even before getting to that point of seeking input and listening, comes a lot of relationship building and a lot of efforts at being open and transparent so that you have trust. And it's a lot better to build that trust before you need it, so that when you're dealing with one of those wicked problems, there's an assumption of good intent that really this is all of us trying together to come up with what's best for the community.
And there's a lot of ways that people can engage with their governments and things that the cities and school districts will do. I mean, you can go to a council meeting and speak at oral communications on the public, where I guess that's where you can just talk about anything that's not on the agenda.
Right.
And then there's public hearings where you really want people to testify about a particular topic. Right? But then I know the city does workshops and focus groups and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about those? Because people think about council meetings and going to testify, but not the other ways to engage. And you may have been involved a little bit in that, Nancy, but.
Sure. Often a city, and hopefully cities will, when undertaking something that is significant in the way that it is going to seek to enact the community's will or make some kind of change in the community, whether it's a new regulation or a new big infrastructure project or maybe a new park, traffic calming. That's a really great example for things that can go right or go wrong in engagement, or long-range planning, like the North Bay Shore Precise Plan in Mountain View, or a budget shortfall. Having some kind of problem to solve that requires ongoing education of the public about what the issues are, and then also input from the public about what the solutions should be. And so for long-range plans, for example, there are things like charrettes, which really allow people to play with the ideas of what things should look like and how they should work together and fit together. Sometimes those are broad so that the community at large is invited. Sometimes things are more targeted towards, say, if it's something that's going to impact, like the downtown transit center in Mountain View. So there was very targeted outreach to the business communities.
Closing the Castro Grade
right,
crossing.
right, so that
thing.
there could be a solution that doesn't have everything at grade. Right, and lots of different trade-offs and different options. And so for people to understand and have input into those options, there often are very specific workshops and lots of different ways that the city tries to get the word out about those workshops so that people can participate.
Great. So Nancy, I know in Los Altos, the Los Altos City Council and city government does a lot along the same avenues as Mountain View and other cities. Yeah. Which sort of vehicle did you first use when you started getting involved in local government?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me today. I'm definitely coming at this from the resident's point of view. So, as a resident, we all get involved in our communities in different ways and at different points in time. For a lot of us, it doesn't happen until there's a critical issue that's right in front of us that we wake up and say, oh my God, how did this happen? Or why did it happen? And for me, the day I woke up had to do with safe routes to school. And in my particular neighborhood, several of us neighbors got together and we realized that we had 3 major intersections that didn't have any crosswalks, and we had kids going to several different schools. And we were standing around scratching our heads saying, well, why is this? And before I knew it, we had begun sort of a process and a path that took us almost a year and a half of trying to reach out and understand. And that's something that doesn't come naturally for a lot of residents. So we don't all have that insight into how to work with our cities. So this is a topic that's near and dear to me. Is the more I learned, the more I became enthusiastic and interested and wanted to know, because it's important as a resident to be able to work with our city. So I reached out, and we ended up going to multiple council meetings, commission meetings, trying to understand the financial process of how a major project gets funded, getting into the 10-year CIP plan and finding out where our little project was in that, and then how do we try to elevate it. And so it was a real learning process, but it was great. In the end, we ended up getting all 3 crosswalks built. But for me, that just increased my curiosity on how other things work. So, I've learned a lot over the years, and I've worked on a lot of different projects and issues. But that one in particular always stands out because that was the first one, and it was a great learning experience.
Now, in that situation with the Safe Routes to Schools, was that sort of a controversial issue amongst various aspects of the community, or were you really just trying to drive a new issue to the city without a lot of neighborhood controversy?
Well, luckily for me, that first issue was fairly non-controversial.
So softball.
That was a good one to start with, because we all want our kids to be safe, and everybody wants to see more kids walking, more kids riding, but we also have to provide a safe environment for that. So that was not too controversial, but other projects I've worked on have been more so. And I think for me, it was also just understanding the process so that we could work through it, and then elevating the need in the minds of the council members and city staff that, hey, we might be somewhere down on the list, but in reality, we have a high need. So how to go about trying to elevate that process. So it was a good one to start to cut my teeth on. Yeah.
Interesting you should mention the CIP, which is the
Capital Improvement
Program. I've been out too long, but Tuesday night in Mountain View, study session on the Capital Improvement Program. One of the things you were talking about, Nancy, was so you sort of got your feet wet, gave it a try,
right? But
then you started to learn. It sounded like you said, "Wow, we can accomplish something if we use our voice."
Exactly.
And so it sounds like you've moved on and learned to use your voice more often.
True. True. I became fascinated with how the city does work, and I started out, one of the things I did is within Los Altos, and I think Mountain View as well, has something called a leadership program. It's a wonderful way to get to know your community, and allows you to look at different aspects of it, everything from the business community to the school community to how the city government works. And now not everybody can take it, but I do recommend it if people can. And once I did that, it really opened my eyes to what, how all these different entities work together. And I became more involved in other issues. But for example, I worked for several years on advocating for a new community center and a new teen center. And those were harder and longer, and in some cases more, not controversial, but there were more complicated elements to them. But everything I did just opened my eyes to how we can have a voice and what it takes. It's not easy. Not every resident just automatically knows how to go about it. They find that there's a lot of people who don't understand the process and what city staff does and what city council does and who to go to for what. So it's important to learn, yeah.
Well, and your experience reminds me of in Mountain View, and I think it was before you got to Mountain View, was the Castro Safe Routes to School, also known as the road diet, which was going down from like 2 lanes in each direction down to...
just after I got there.
Right.
And it's now finally fully implemented.
Right. But that was pretty controversial, even amongst, parents and people that lived in the neighborhood, because it was affecting their mobility and
parking issues.
Traffic calming is really one of the best
examples.
case studies.
Yes, it's right up there.
Right.
Audrey, from the city staff perspective, there's clearly impacts on members of the city council who are, as Leslie Knope would say, get to bear the brunt of people caring passionately at them, in a council meeting. But from staff's perspective, in terms of where there is controversy, sort of in the public engagement realm, how does staff process that and be aware of that and sort of manage that before it gets to the council?
Well, it's a really good question. I think it helps as a staff person to remember our roles as public servants, and I mean that in the most lofty and not servile term, that we really do have an important role to help these complicated issues come before the council in a way that can allow good decision making, and that the council expects from us, as they should, that we will have reached out to the community and be able to bring that input into whatever recommendation that staff is making. And we also have experience working in city government and our professional training and expertise that we can bring to bear on what are the underlying issues that are creating a certain situation, what are the range of alternatives, what are the kinds of things you'd want to think about with regard to cost and feasibility and other kinds of impacts, and trying to make that as clear as possible. And as I said before, the transparency is important. And I also think non-defensiveness is important. And I think that can sometimes be hard when passions are high. And sometimes when people are passionate, they aren't assuming good intent of their public servants. I think that it's best to be, kind of centered in those kinds of situations, to know that the role we have is still important, and we can be open and listen openly and communicate, clearly and non-defensively. I think part of what is really challenging, and maybe can be a frustration from a staff perspective, is that, I might feel, rightly or wrongly, that I have an understanding that is maybe more nuanced or more comprehensive in terms of an awareness of the different complications. Sounds like Nancy really made it a point to learn about that so that you could be effective in your advocacy. because to hear that if you just cared enough, you would do X, or if you were more competent, you would do X, or if you weren't in the pocket of some special interest, you would, and I think without exception, I've worked with people with really high degrees of professionalism and integrity who are trying to bring those different nuanced and complicated factors together into a solution that often takes longer than people think it should.
Right.
And if it doesn't look like what people have as their own preferred option or their own set of assumptions or expectations. And so I think that puts the burden on us in local government to try to communicate as, in a way that's really clear about what the issue is, so that every resident can be like a city council member, like you were when you were on council, so that you have a full awareness of the trade-offs. And there have been some really interesting examples of deliberative democracy, where, say, around a budget shortfall, where it's not just protect this thing that I care about, but gee, if we protect this, that means something else has to be cut, or that means the revenue has to be raised, and really give people enough information that they can put themselves in that hot seat, that decision maker's seat. But that's hard. It's hard to capture people's attention, right? Because people are so busy. And it's hard to sustain that attention because things do take a long time.
It's interesting, as you were saying, it's this, even the simple issues are more complicated than I think the average person understands, because there are so many differing implications. And I love what you were saying about how long it takes. Is sort of the inside joke I used to recall, especially working with Kevin Duggan, our former city manager at Mountain View, is like part of the problem with public engagement and the people's right to have public hearings is it takes a lot longer that way. If you didn't have all of these opportunities for people to weigh in, and then the council to say, well, let's go back and study that some more, things would happen a lot faster. So sometimes, as people say, democracy can be messy. Nancy, I was wondering, in your experiences, it sounded like you had gotten into things that were more controversial.
True.
And what sort of things did you sort of glean from those experiences?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say with Audrey that I certainly understand. I have a lot of empathy now with what the city staff and the council have to undertake for just doing their day-to-day jobs. And there are a lot of nuances. And if somehow, and there's no magic way of doing this, but getting the residents as a whole to understand that process better, because most residents really don't have a clear idea until they get involved. So for me, I've been involved in a lot of different various projects and issues. We've been working through what we call downtown visioning right now. And that's been an ongoing process for years. And I think our city did a tremendous job, because we did hire a consultant who came in and did 30 or 40 different outreach with the community, meetings, went out into the community to have conversations. So that's important, because if we just rely on residents to show up at city council meetings, they usually come when they're upset about something. So getting out into the community helps. And then now a new element which has come into play recently, which we didn't have before, is a lot of the communities have what's called Nextdoor online. And so a lot of conversations happen on this online, platform, but the city isn't necessarily involved in that. So there's
in fact, we can't.
You really can't. And so it can become a really tricky environment where sometimes there's a lot of false information put out there, and then people form opinions without knowing all the nuances or the background or the history. And so that creates even more complications. And
Speaking of online platforms, KMVT has started working with a new company, Polco.
Okay.
And they do online surveying of local governments and nonprofits. And so we actually put some questions up on the KMVT platform, and I'll just go through some of the results here. And we didn't have a huge outpouring of people because it's brand new, But the first one was, have you spoken at a city council or other local official government meeting? And of the people that responded, and it was only 15 people, but 87% of those said yes, 13% no. But what I thought was surprising was that 93% of those said they felt heard when they had made that. And, you know, does that surprise either of you that these sound like they may be veterans
Right.
of public engagement, but
Well, I think it's always good when the council can explain the process, which our agendas do, and the mayor will tell the public how the process is going to work. And when council and staff pay attention when people are speaking, and they are thanked for speaking, even if they do not win the day.
Right.
And under public comment, you can't because it's a non-agendized item if it's just the oral communications. And even under a public hearing or something that's a specific decision being made, you know, the council may decide in a way that isn't consistent with an individual's input. But if the process is done correctly, people can feel heard. They know that they showed up. They know that they were part of the voices that were considered. Right. And often elected officials, council members will reflect back what they heard. They will talk about the ways that it influenced their decision, or if they aren't going in that direction, they'll explain why. Right. That's always a nice thing that council can kind of explain the rationale for why they're voting in the way that they are. And I think most people, even when they can't have things go the way that they had hoped, if they understand what did happen and why it happened, I think that they will feel heard.
Right. And I've seen many mayors in Mountain View, and I suspect in Los Altos and others, that really do sort of manage the process, and they don't allow clapping, and so that, or booing, you know, when somebody gets up and says something that might not be popular to those in the room, which makes it easier for the people to make their comment. And I always found, you know, when I was on the council that, well, you may not get exactly what you wanted, but comments can still influence. So you may not win the day, but you can influence the day. And that is part of the process. And I mean, you've probably experienced that as well.
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the best things for people to do and residents to do is have at least one time gone to council and spoken, because I think for me, you do feel like you've been heard. And that's the only way you can't just sit at home and complain about it when you read the newspaper. But showing up and making a comment, and as you said, whether that comment is immediately acted upon or not doesn't really matter. I've always walked away and felt I've been heard. So for me, it feels good, and you are part of the process, and you can write letters, and you can write letters to the editor, to the media, and you can find other ways to reach out to those council members. But do your homework and find out first where things are happening in the process. Reach out to staff. And so that helps tremendously.
One of the other questions we put up on the survey was, how did people find out about the topic that was going on in the meeting? And about 33% of the people said they got a notice in the mail. And I know there are state laws about providing notice of certain items on the agenda. Maybe if you could really briefly just sort of touch base what that is. I mean,
right. And I don't remember the specific numbers, but it deals both with the number of days in advance of a public hearing, and also the notice radius from whatever project site. If we're talking about a land use project.
So like immediate neighbors know that there might be a building going up in their neighborhood.
Right, and that's the minimum of what an organization needs to do. For Mountain View's council, they recently approved a more, not aggressive, but more favorable, a larger, both longer days, so 14-day rather than 10 days, and 1,000 feet rather than, I think, 750 is the requirement in the state.
That's great.
And then you can also do a lot more than that. You can collect the names and emails of people who are interested in certain topics, and then you send out notices to them. You can put things out on Nextdoor and other social media.
Right.
I'd just like to add to that the more a city can do, the better.
Right.
So I'm thrilled to hear that Mountain View is actually extending their radius and the number of days. And I'd love to see that in my community too, because oftentimes we'll have a project which has only a 500 square foot radius, and it turns out that the people 1,000 square feet away are just as concerned. And by the time they hear about it, it's already done, and then they're upset. So the more the city can do, the better. Yeah.
I mean, other comments on here, they heard about it on Nextdoor.
Yep.
They read a notice in the newspaper, because I think most organizations will post certain notices or agenda notices. You can also sign up for the agenda to get notice from the city clerk, or just hearing about it from your neighbors and that sort of thing. You know, one of the things I wanted to ask you, Nancy, is have you found any particular sort of ways of engaging staff or local or your elected officials? I mean, are there things that are better than others? Like, how about like the 3 minutes, that oral communication from the public, compared to setting up a coffee and having a one-on-one meeting with somebody?
Absolutely. I think there's a time and a place for everything, and I'm really thrilled at how responsive staff is. When you have a question, it's pretty easy to, well, I won't say easy, but if you take a little time and a little effort, you can find out who that person is that you need to reach out to. And staff has been very responsive. And if you still have a question that hasn't been answered, then you take it to council, or you take it to one of the commissions, and you might have 3 minutes, or you might have 2, or you might have 1. It depends on how many people are in the audience. So you have to be prepared what you want to say or ask, and a lot of times you can't get an answer while you're standing there. So being able to follow up afterwards, emails are available for each council member. Ask them to coffee. Most, if not all, council members are very open to that. And that's a chance to just meet with them, explain how you feel, ask them how they feel. Brainstorm some additional ideas. Right. So I definitely highly recommend that. And any way you can use, whether it's one-on-one or in meetings or sending emails.
I personally found letters and emails to be particularly ineffective. You get them, either a pile of them at the meeting, and you don't have time to look at them.
Good point.
And if you show up to testify, you only get 2 minutes or 3 minutes. You don't get a conversation. It's one way.
Right.
So
trying to develop a relationship with a council member would be really, it is very helpful when you can do that.
Yeah, yeah. Real quick question. I mean, people always call council members. Can people call staff and set up a meeting to talk with a planner or a public works person or city management?
They absolutely can.
Okay, great. Well, believe it or not, our 3 minutes are almost up, and time flies when you're having a good time. But I wanted to thank you both, Audrey Ramberg, for being here today, and for you, Nancy. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for our first show of In the Know. And we're going to be looking at some other really interesting topics coming up around RV dwellers, schools, possibly the CASA Compact and housing. And I would encourage those of you that would like to be more involved to get involved with Polco at polco.us. Thank you for joining us today.